The dust was a living thing. It was the third mouth to feed, the second shadow in the room, a constant, grit-toothed whisper against the loose panes of the window. It coated the inside of Alara's throat, a fine silt that made every swallow a conscious effort. It settled in the folds of her mother's quilt, turning the vibrant patches of calico into a uniform, sorrowful gray. It was the color of the world now, the color of the sky, the color of the future. A world bleached of promise. Inside their one-room shack, the air was thick and stagnant, tasting of dry earth and the faint, sweet scent of fever. Faye lay on the thin mattress in the corner, a small, still form beneath the grayed quilt. Her breaths were shallow, each one a tiny, rasping struggle, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a stone. Dust pneumonia, the doctor in town had called it, before shrugging with a weariness that offered no hope. He had nothing to give but a name for the thief that was stealing her sister's life. Alara knelt beside her, dipping a rag into the bucket of murky water. The water was low, the last of what she'd hauled 2 days ago, and a skin of dust floated on its surface. She wrung out the cloth and gently wiped Faye's brow, tracing the delicate, blue-veined temple where the skin was stretched taut over bone. Faye's eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were now clouded, unfocused. They stared at the ceiling, seeing nothing of the water stains that looked like maps of forgotten countries. She hadn't spoken in a day, hadn't eaten in 3. Hunger was a hollow ache in Alara's own stomach, a familiar companion she had learned to ignore. But Faye's hunger, Faye's wasting away, was a physical torment. It was a tightening in her chest, a fire in her gut that no amount of dust could smother. Their father had left for California 6 months prior, promising to send for them once he found work in the orchards. His letters, full of hope at first, had become shorter, less frequent, and then had stopped altogether. Like the rain, the cupboard held nothing but a handful of weevily flour and a jar of salt. The small garden patch out back, once her mother's pride, was a graveyard of withered stalks, their roots choked by the relentless, suffocating earth. The dust had taken everything. It had taken the crops, the letters, the hope. Now it was taking her sister. Desperation was a cold, sharp thing. It stripped away pride, peeled back dignity until only the raw nerve of survival remained. Alara looked at her hands, chapped and raw, the nails broken and rimmed with grime. They were useless hands. They could not conjure rain or till the concrete soil. They could not soothe the rattle in Faye's chest. But they could work. They had to. She stood, the movement stiff and slow, her joints aching from kneeling. She pulled her father's worn coat from a nail on the wall, the ruffle scratching her skin. It smelled of him, of sweat and distant fields, a scent that was fading day by day. She looked back at Faye, a fierce, protective love swelling in her throat until it felt like a sob. "I'll be back," she whispered, the words lost in the perpetual sigh of the wind outside. "I'll bring something back." The walk to town was a battle. The wind was a physical force, pushing against her, whipping her hair across her face and forcing the fine, red dust into her eyes and lungs. The sun was a pale, impotent disk behind a haze. The world was a canvas of brown and gray, the horizon blurred, indistinct. There was no line between earth and sky, only a swirling vortex of grit. The town of Redemption was a collection of skeletal buildings huddled together, as if for warmth. False fronts peeled, paint scoured away by the wind, windows boarded up or stared out like vacant eyes. The few people on the street moved with their heads down, shoulders hunched, as if carrying the weight of the sky. They were ghosts in their own lives, haunting the ruins of their own prosperity. Alara's gaze scanned the street, seeking she didn't know what. A moment of charity? An offer of work? But the faces she saw were closed, tight with their own misery. Pity was a currency no one could afford to spend. Then she saw him. He was sitting on the edge of the boardwalk in front of the defunct livery stable, his back against the post. He was an outsider. She'd heard the whispers. A man who kept to himself, who worked odd jobs for cash and lived in a small, isolated cabin out by the dried-up creek bed. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, durable clothes that were dusty but not ragged. and on his feet, he wore a pair of sturdy leather boots. They were scuffed and coated in a thick layer of red dust, but she could see the quality in them. They were the boots of a man who walked his own path, a man who was grounded, who wasn't about to be blown away by the wind. His name, she thought she'd heard, was Silas. He was cleaning apart from some piece of machinery, his hands methodical and sure. He seemed utterly self-contained, a small island of purpose in the sea of aimless despair that was redemption. The desperation in her sharpened to a single point. It was a humiliating, terrifying idea, a prayer formed from the basest of needs. She clutched the fabric of her father's coat, her knuckles white. She thought of Faye's shallow breathing, of the hollows beneath her eyes. Pride was a luxury. Dignity was a meal she hadn't eaten in a week. She took a breath, the air searing her lungs, and walked toward him. Her own worn shoes made no sound in the thick dust of the street. He didn't look up until her shadow fell over him. He slowly raised his head, his eyes squinting against the perpetual gloom. They were dark, watchful eyes, their expression unreadable. He had a face carved by the elements, all sharp angles and quiet endurance. He said nothing. He simply waited. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. The words felt like stones in her mouth, heavy and coarse. She forced them out, her voice a low, hoarse whisper, nearly stolen by the wind. "Mister," she began, her gaze fixed on the caked mud and dust on his footwear. "Polish your boots for Grub." He continued to look at her, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched, filled only by the keening of the wind. In that silence, Alara felt the full weight of her shame. She was a beggar, a piece of driftwood tossed on a dusty tide. She expected him to laugh, or to turn away in disgust, a gesture that would shatter the last fragile piece of her. He did neither. His dark eyes moved from her face, down to her trembling hands, then to the worn-out shoes peeking from beneath her hem. He seemed to take in her entire existence in that one sweeping glance. Then, his gaze returned to her face. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't speak, didn't bargain, didn't question. He simply leaned back slightly, extending one booted foot. The gesture was an answer, a concession, a small, quiet act of grace in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. For Alara, it felt like the first drop of rain after a decade of drought. The act of kneeling was not one of submission, but of transaction. Alara lowered herself into the dust of the street, the rough ground pressing into her knees through the thin fabric of her dress. She had come prepared in a way. From the deep pocket of her father's coat, she pulled a small, soft rag, once part of a linen sheet, and a nearly empty tin of saddle soap she'd found in the abandoned barn behind their shack. Its scent, a faint, waxy smell of lanolin and pine, was a ghost of a time when people had things worth protecting, worth preserving. Silas remained silent, his foot held steady. He watched her, not with the leering curiosity of the town's other men, but with a quiet, unnerving stillness. His gaze wasn't heavy, but it was present, and Alara felt it on the curve of her spine on the top of her bowed head. She focused on the boot. It was a universe of its own. The leather was thick and worn, scarred with the history of his journeys. There were nicks from rocks, scratches from thorns, a dark stain near the toe that might have been oil. A map of a hard life. She began with the dry rag, brushing away the thickest layers of red dust. It rose in a fine cloud around her, mingling with the ever-present haze in the air. She worked meticulously, her fingers tracing the seams, clearing the grit from the space between the sole and the upper. This was not just about payment. This was about earning. It was about proving that her request was not a plea for a handout, but an offer of labor. Her father had taught her that. A person's worth was in their work. Once the boot was free of the loose dirt, she opened the tin of soap. There was only a small amount left, clinging to the bottom. She used the tip of her finger to scoop out a tiny dollop, rubbing it into the damp section of her rag. Then, with small, circular motions, she began to work it into the leather. The soap lathered slightly, turning the red dust to a muddy brown. She could feel the leather beginning to soften under her touch, drinking in the moisture and the oil. The boot began to transform. A deep, rich cordovan color emerged from beneath the grime, like a secret being revealed. A faint luster returned to the surface. She worked with a singular focus, the world narrowing to the space of that single boot. The whispers of the wind, the distant clang of a hammer, the judgmental eyes of Mrs. Gable peering from the window of the general store, it all faded into a dull background hum. There was only the rhythmic motion of her hand, the smell of the soap, the solid presence of the man before her. When she was satisfied with the first boot, she paused, looking up at him through her lashes. His expression was still unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her hands, on the care she was taking. Without a word, he drew back his polished foot and extended the other. She repeated the process, her movements more confident now. She was no longer just a desperate girl in the street. She was a person performing a task, and performing it well. The second boot shone with the same dull, healthy gleam as the first. They looked like proper boots again, ready to face the road. She used the last clean corner of her rag to give them a final buff, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the reflection of the pale, hazy sun on the toe. She had done it. She had created a small pocket of order and care in a world of chaos and neglect. Finally, she sat back on her heels, her work complete. She looked up at him, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm. The transaction was over. Now came the payment. Silas looked down at his boots, turning his ankle one way and then the other, as if reacquainting himself with them. He then looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to respect. He reached into the canvas satchel that rested beside him on the boardwalk. Alara's stomach clenched. She expected a coin, perhaps a nickel, which would buy a small scoop of cornmeal, enough for a thin gruel for Faye. Instead, his hand emerged with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He held out to her. It was heavy. Her hands trembled as she took it. It was warm. He then reached back into the bag and pulled out a strip of dried meat, its surface dark and glossy with salt. He placed it on top of the parcel. Her eyes widened. This was too much. This was more than a fair trade. This was charity disguised as commerce. It's too much, she stammered, the words catching in her dry throat. Silas simply shook his head, a small, sharp gesture. He stood up, his full height casting a long shadow even in the weak light. He looked down at her, still kneeling in the dust, the precious food clutched in her hands. "Eat," he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, yet it held no menace. It was a command, but also an acknowledgement of her need. He gave her one last, lingering look, then turned and walked away down the desolate street, his newly polished boots leaving clean, sharp prints in the dust. Alara watched him go until he was just a dark shape swallowed by the haze. She looked down at the food in her hands. The paper was soaked with grease from what was inside. She carefully unwrapped a corner. A thick slice of bread, still warm from an oven, and a hunk of cheese. It was a feast. It was life. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks before dropping onto the paper, making dark, round spots. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the food to her chest like a holy relic, and began the long walk home, her own steps now a little surer, a little less likely to be swept away by the wind. The food was a weight, a warmth, an anchor in the storm. The bread was dense and wholesome, with a hard crust that scraped the roof of her mouth. Alara tore off a small piece and chewed it slowly, letting the simple, earthy flavor fill her senses. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She forced herself to stop after 2 bites, wrapping the parcel carefully again. This was for Faye. This was the reason for the burning shame and the raw knees. Back in the shack, the air was unchanged. Faye was as she had been, a pale wisp of a girl lost in the gray landscape of the bedding. Alara knelt beside her again, her heart a painful knot of hope and fear. "Faye," she whispered, her voice gentle. "Faye, I brought something. Something good." There was no response. Faye's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. Alara broke off a tiny crumb of the bread's soft interior, no bigger than a pea. She dipped it in the murky water to soften it further, then gently touched it to her sister's lips. Faye's mouth was dry, her lips cracked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a flicker of instinct. Her lips parted slightly, and Alara carefully pushed the morsel inside. Faye's throat worked, a small, spasmodic swallow. It was a victory. It was a sign. Alara continued this for what felt like hours, a painstaking ritual of crumb and water, crumb and water. Faye swallowed each time, her body responding on some primal level, even if her mind was far away. Alara saved the jerky and cheese for herself, eating her small portion in the corner, her back to her sister, as if ashamed of her own body's insistent demands. The food did not fill the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, but quieted it, giving her a sliver of strength she hadn't realized she'd lost. The wind rose as evening fell, shrieking around the corners of the shack, forcing dust through the cracks in the walls and whispering ghostly plumes. Alara lit their single lantern, the small flame casting huge, dancing shadows that made the room feel both smaller and more menacing. She sat on a stool, watching the frail life in the bed, her mind replaying the encounter in town. Silas. He was a puzzle. The townspeople treated him with suspicion. He was a man without a past, a drifter who had settled on the edge of their dying community for reasons no one understood. They said he was unfriendly, that he had a coldness about him. But his actions had not been cold. They had been efficient, direct. He had seen a need and met it, without the condescending pity that would have been so much harder to bear. He had allowed her to keep her dignity, even as she knelt in the dirt. He had paid her for her work and paid her generously. The food ran out 2 days later. It was a brief reprieve, a small island of sustenance in an ocean of want. Faye's condition had not worsened, but it had not improved either. She was holding on, a tiny, stubborn flame flickering in the gale. The hollow ache returned to Alara's belly, sharper this time, fueled by the memory of what it felt like to be sated. She knew she could not go back to Silas with the same offer. The boots were clean. A transaction had to be fair. She spent a morning searching the shack, her hands running over their few, meager possessions. Her mother's wedding band was long since sold. The good plates, the silver locket, all gone, traded for flour and beans that were now just a memory. In her father's sea chest, tucked beneath a stack of his old, threadbare shirts, she found what she was looking for. A mending kit, a small wooden box containing needles, a thimble, and a few spools of sturdy thread. One of Silas's shirts had been frayed at the cuff, she remembered. A small detail, but she had noticed it. Another offer of labor. Another chance. She found him this time not in town, but on the edge of his small plot of land, a half-mile past the last house. He was mending a fence line, his movements economical and strong as he stretched a length of wire and secured it to a post. The wind tore at his clothes, but he seemed as rooted to the earth as the post he was driving. He saw her coming from a long way off. He stopped his work, resting his hands on top of a post, and simply waited. He was a man who did a lot of waiting. Alara's steps faltered as she drew closer. Out here, with no one else around, the world felt vast and empty. The silence between them was bigger. She felt small, an intruder in his solitary world. She stopped a few feet from him, holding up the small wooden box. "Your shirt cuff," she said, her voice thin against the wind. "I saw it was torn. I can mend it." He looked from a box to her face. His eyes, she saw now, were the color of dark, wet earth. They held a profound stillness. She couldn't tell if he was amused, annoyed, or indifferent. He studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, he stripped off his work gloves and began to unbutton his shirt. He did not hand it to her. Instead, he turned his arm toward her, extending his wrist, the frayed cuff exposed. It was an invitation, an act of trust that startled her. Her hands trembled as she took the rough fabric in her fingers. His skin was warm beneath the cloth. She could feel the heat of him, a stark contrast to the cold wind. She fumbled with the needle, her fingers clumsy at first. She threaded it with a dark gray thread that almost matched the fabric, her eyes squinting with concentration. Then she began to stitch. Her stitches were small and neat, just as her mother had taught her. A straight, strong line of thread that pulled the frayed edges together, making them whole again. He stood perfectly still, a statue of patience, while she worked. He did not speak, did not move. He simply allowed her this proximity, this small, strange intimacy. She was aware of his breathing, slow and steady. She could smell the scent of dust, sweat, and clean air that clung to him. When she was finished, she bit the thread and smoothed the fabric with her thumb. The repair was barely visible. It was good, strong work. There, she whispered. She let go of his arm, and the warmth was gone. He flexed his fingers, looking at the mended cuff. He gave another one of his small, sharp nods. He turned and walked to a small, well-kept shed near his cabin. He returned not with food, but with a small, heavy burlap sack. He pressed it into her hands. "Potatoes," he said, the second word he'd ever spoken to her. The sack was heavy, solid. It was a promise of many meals of earthy, nourishing substance. In this, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of oilcloth. He pressed it into her other hand. Inside were 3 eggs, their shells a pale, perfect brown, a luxury she hadn't seen in over a year. She looked up at him, her throat too tight to speak. He had given her more than food. He had given her a measure of hope. His dark eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flicker of something else in their depths. Not pity, but shared understanding of the harsh arithmetic of survival. He had seen her need, and he had met it again on her terms. As she walked away, the weight of the potatoes a comforting burden, she did not feel shame. She felt a strange, burgeoning sense of connection to the silent man on the hill, a connection forged in the language of work and need, a language that required no other words. The potatoes were a godsend. Small, gnarled, but firm. Alara boiled them, mashing them with a little water and salt to make a thin, nourishing soup. She fed it to Faye, spoonful by spoonful, the same way she had with the bread. The warmth of the soup seemed to seep into her sister's frail body, bringing a faint touch of color to her cheeks. For the first time in a week, Faye's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved about the cabin. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but to Alara it was a seismic shift, a crack of light in a suffocating darkness. The eggs were a treasure. She boiled one, peeled it carefully, and mashed the yolk with a fork. She fed tiny portions of it to Faye, a potent dose of protein and fat. She ate the white herself, savoring its clean, rubbery texture. She was learning to live in these small moments of grace, to hoard them like a miser hoarding gold. Life was no longer measured in days or weeks, but in single, precious swallows. The world outside, however, remained hostile. The dust was a constant presence, a fine powder that covered everything, a perpetual reminder of their poverty and isolation. But something inside Alara was beginning to change. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was now accompanied by a sliver of resolve, a stubborn refusal to be broken. This resolve was tied, in some inexplicable way, to the silent man on the hill. His quiet competence, his stark generosity, had become a focal point for her, an anchor in the swirling chaos. He had not offered sympathy. He had offered tools for survival. Potatoes, eggs, the dignity of a fair trade. He made her feel not like a victim, but like a partner in a difficult enterprise. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant moaning companion, fell eerily silent. An unnatural stillness descended upon the land, heavy and oppressive. The air grew thick, difficult to breathe. Alara knew the signs. She had seen it twice before. A black blizzard was coming. She hurried outside, her heart pounding. She checked the boards over the windows, securing a loose one with a rusty nail. She stuffed rags into the cracks around the doorframe. She brought the water bucket inside, covering it with a piece of wood. These were the rituals of survival, small acts of defiance against the overwhelming power of the elements. She drew Faye's mattress away from the wall and into the center of the room, hoping to protect her from the dust that would inevitably seep through the walls. She looked at her sister, whose eyes were wide now, reflecting a primal fear that needed no words. The storm hit not with a roar, but with a sudden, terrifying plunge into darkness. One moment there was the jaundiced twilight, the next, absolute black. The sun was extinguished. The world was gone. Then came the sound. It was not just wind. It was a solid wall of moving earth, a billion particles of sand and topsoil, scouring the world. It was a physical assault, a deep, grinding roar that vibrated through the floorboards and up into her bones. The shack groaned under the pressure, the timbers straining. Dust began to pour through the walls in streams, thick as smoke. It filled the air, acrid and suffocating. Alara tore a strip from sheet, soaked it in precious water, and tied it around Faye's mouth and nose. She did the same for herself. They huddled together on the mattress, two small figures in an apocalyptic tempest. The roar was deafening. The darkness was total. Alara held Faye's hand, her own trembling. She could feel the fine silt settling on her skin, in her hair, on her eyelids. She closed her eyes, but the darkness was the same behind her lids as it was in the room. This was what it felt like to be buried alive. Time ceased to exist. There were only the shuddering of the shack and the terrifying, relentless noise. Hours passed. A sudden, violent crack echoed above the roar, followed by a splintering sound. A section of the roof near the corner had given way. Dust and debris rained down, and a new, more menacing sound joined the symphony of chaos, the high-pitched shriek of wind tearing at the exposed shingles. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's stoicism. The shack was their only shelter. If the roof went, they would be exposed, swallowed by the storm. She pulled Faye closer, shielding her small body with her own, and began to pray. Not to a god she no longer believed in, but to the fragile timbers of the shack, to the rusty nails holding them together, to whatever stubborn spirit of survival still resided within these four walls. Sometime later, in a brief lull in the wind's fury, she heard another sound. A heavy, rhythmic thudding from outside. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. She strained her ears, thinking it was just a new trick of the storm. But there was again. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the roof. Someone was on the roof, in the middle of a black blizzard. A new kind of terror seized her. Who would be out in this? A madman? A thief? The thudding continued, followed by the sound of wood being wedged into place, the sharp report of a hammer striking nails. Someone was not destroying their shelter. Someone was reinforcing it. She lay there, frozen, listening to the sounds of her salvation. The work was swift, efficient, and impossibly brave. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who it was. It could only be him, Silas. He was up there, in the heart of the maelstrom, fighting the storm for them, fighting for a girl who had mended his shirt and polished his boots. The thought was so overwhelming, so staggering in its implications, that it broke through her fear. She was not alone in the dark. As the hammering continued, a steady, reassuring rhythm against the chaos, Alara held her sister's hand tighter. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The storm still raged. The world outside was still a vortex of black dust, but inside the small, fragile shack, a tiny, resilient seed of hope had been planted. The sound from the roof were the sound of a debt being paid, not one she had asked for, but one he had chosen to honor. It was the sound of a silent promise being kept. The storm raged for another day and a night, a relentless siege that tested the limits of endurance. When the wind finally began to recede, it did so grudgingly, its roar diminishing to a mournful howl, then a whisper, then an exhausted sigh. The darkness gradually lifted, replaced by the familiar, murky twilight of a dust-choked sky. Silence, when it came, was a shock. It was a heavy, weighted thing, pressing in on the ears, making the small sounds inside the shack. Faye's shallow breathing, the drip of water from a new leak in the roof, seemed unnaturally loud. The world Alara emerged into was a transformed landscape. Everything was buried. A thick, rolling blanket of red dust, like fine, soft snow, covered the ground, piled in deep drifts against the side of the shack and the withered skeletons of the garden. The air was still thick with haze, and the sun was a pale, ghostly smudge. It was a world erased, a blank slate of desolation. On the roof, she could see the evidence of Silas's work. A large piece of corrugated tin, scavenged from somewhere, was nailed securely over the damaged section. Heavy planks that would reinforce the edges. It was a rough, ugly patch, but it was strong. It had held. He had saved them. There was no sign of him. He had come like a phantom in the storm and vanished just as quietly, leaving only the proof of his presence hammered into their roof. The act felt impossibly large, a gesture of profound, unspoken care that left Alara feeling humbled and deeply indebted. The first task was clearing the dust. It was a Herculean effort. It had poured in through every crack, forming a thick, suffocating layer over the floor, the furniture, the quilt. She started with a shovel, scooping the fine silt into buckets and hauling it outside, creating a new, smaller mountain of dust beside the door. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, but she worked with a grim determination. This was her home. She would reclaim it from the dust. As she worked, she saw him approaching in the distance, a dark figure moving steadily across the surreal, dune-like landscape. He carried a shovel over his shoulder and a wooden bucket in his other hand. He did not call out a greeting. He simply walked up to the shack, took a bucket from her, and began to work alongside her. They worked in silence, a shared rhythm of scoop, lift, and empty. The sheer volume of dust was overwhelming, but with two of them, the impossible task became merely difficult. He was tireless, his movements efficient and powerful. He cleared the deep drift from against the front door, then moved to help her clear the inside. There was an easy comfort in their shared labor. No words were needed. The storm had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the fundamental reality of their situation. They were two people fighting against a hostile world, and in that fight, they had found a strange, unspoken alliance. When the bulk of the dust was cleared, Silas set down his shovel and picked up the wooden bucket he had brought. He walked toward the old hand pump for their well, its iron handle rising from a mound of dust. "Pump's probably choked," Alara said, her voice hoarse from the dust and disuse. "Might be dry anyway." He didn't answer. He dug around the base of the pump, clearing the mechanism. Then he took the bucket, which she now saw was filled with water, and poured a small amount down the pump's throat. He worked the handle, a priming action. For a long time, there was only a dry, sucking gasp. Alara watched, her hope dwindling. The well had been failing for months. But Silas was patient. He worked the handle with a steady, relentless rhythm. Then a gurgle, a sputter, and finally a thick, muddy trickle of water oozed from the spout. It wasn't much, but it was water. He pumped until the water ran clearer, filling her bucket with the precious, life-sustaining liquid. He then turned his attention to the sad patch of earth that had once been her garden. He took a stick and drew a line in the newly deposited dust, a few feet from where the old rows had been. He began to dig, not deep, but wide, creating a shallow trench. Alara watched, confused. "What are you doing?" "New topsoil," he said, his fourth and fifth words to her. He gestured to the thick blanket of dust the storm had left. The wind took it from fields up north. "Richer soil. This old ground is dead." It was a revelation. She had only seen the dust as a destructive force, a suffocating plague. He saw it as a gift, a chance for renewal. He showed her how to mix the new, finer dust with the hard-packed clay beneath, how to create a bed that might, with luck and a little water, hold a seed. He had brought a small cloth pouch with him. Inside were a dozen shriveled, precious seeds. Beans, he told her. They didn't need much. They were tough, resilient. Like him, they planted them together, pushing the seeds into the newly prepared earth with their fingers. It was an act of audacious, almost foolish hope. Planting seeds in a dust bowl under a sky that had forgotten how to rain. But as Alara pressed a seed into the cool, dark soil, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A sense of a future. Not a grand, prosperous future like the one her father had chased, but a small, tenacious one. A future that might just be coaxed from the barren ground, one seed at a time. They stood back, surveying their work. A few feet of turned earth, a row of buried seeds. It was a tiny scar of hope on a desolate world. Silas looked at the sky, his eyes narrowed. "Might get a little rain," he said. Soon, Alara followed his gaze. She saw nothing but the endless, hazy gray. But she didn't doubt him. He was a man who knew how to read the world in ways she was only just beginning to understand. He had read the coming storm, and now he was reading the promise of rain. He had shown her that even in the aftermath of destruction, there could be a chance for a new beginning. The promise of rain hung in the air, a tantalizing specter. For days, the sky remained a high, milky gray, but the quality of the light changed. The air felt heavier, holding a moisture that was more memory than reality. The waiting was a quiet torment. Every morning, Alara would check the small patch of garden, her heart sinking a little each time she saw the dry, undisturbed earth. But Silas's quiet confidence had taken root in her, a stubborn weed of hope. She tended the patch, giving it a mouthful of the precious well water each evening, a communion with a future that might never arrive. Her trips to town became less frequent. The small community of Redemption seemed to have shriveled further after the Black Blizzard. More families had packed up and left, their homes standing empty, their windows like the vacant eyes of skulls. The ones who remained were harder, their faces etched with a more profound despair. The town's meager charity had dried up completely. There was only one place to get supplies: Barlow's general store. Jed Barlow was a man who had prospered from the misery of others. He was a small, pot-bellied man with watery eyes and a perpetually damp upper lip. His shelves were still stocked, but his prices were exorbitant, and his ledger was filled with the debts of half the county. He extended credit like a spider spinning a web, waiting for his victims to become hopelessly entangled. Alara had avoided him for as long as she could, but the potatoes were gone, and the salt was running low. Faye needed more than water and hoped to mend fully. Alara entered the store, a small coin clutched in her sweaty palm. The bell above the door jangled, a cheerful sound at odds with the gloom inside. The air was thick with the smells of dust, old wood, and decay. Barlow was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a dirty rag. He looked up as she entered, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, his voice oily. "Thought you and that sister of yours had been buried for good in the storm." Alara ignored the jibe. She placed her coin on the counter. "A pound of cornmeal, Mr. Barlow." "Please." Barlow looked at the coin, then back at her, his smile widening. "A pound of cornmeal is twice that now. Supply and demand. You understand." His eyes roamed over her, lingering on the hollows of her collarbones, the worn fabric of her dress. "But for you, maybe we can come to an arrangement." The implication was as thick and foul as the air in the store. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're a pretty thing, even with all that dust on you. A smart girl could make life a lot more comfortable for herself and her little sister. I've got a storeroom in the back. Warm. Lots of food." A wave of nausea rolled through Alara. Her father had always told her to be proud, that her dignity was the one thing no one could take from her. She looked at Barlow's smug, predatory face, and a cold, hard anger solidified inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't known she was capable of. "I have no arrangement to make with you, Mr. Barlow," she said, her voice low and steady. She picked up her coin. "Good day." She turned to leave, her back straight, her head held high. "You'll be back," he called after her, his voice laced with spite. "They all come back. When that sister of yours is starving, you'll remember my offer." The words followed her out into the dusty street, clinging to her like burrs. She walked away, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. He was right. She would run out of options. The thought was terrifying. She didn't go straight home. Instead, her feet carried her in the direction of Silas's cabin. She didn't know why she was going there, what she would say. She just needed to be near the one place in this desolate world where she had felt a measure of safety. She found him sitting outside his small, sturdy cabin, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as she approached, his hands stilling. He must have seen the distress on her face, because a subtle tension entered his posture. He set down his carving and waited for her to speak. But the words wouldn't come. The shame and fury of the encounter with Barlow had stolen her voice. She just stood there, shaking, the useless coin still clutched in her hand. Silas stood up and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching her face, trying to read the story she couldn't tell. He didn't press her, didn't ask what was wrong. He simply stood with her in the silence, his presence a solid, comforting bulwark against the world. After a long moment, he gestured toward a simple wooden bench he had built against the cabin wall. "Sit," he said. She obeyed, her legs suddenly weak. He went inside his cabin and returned with a dipper of cool, clean water. He handed it to her. She drank, the water soothing the dust and fear in her throat. He sat on the ground near the bench, not beside her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. He picked up his piece of wood and his knife and began to whittle again, the blade making soft, scraping sounds. He wasn't ignoring her. He was giving her space, allowing her to gather herself in her own time. The simple, domestic sound of his work was calming. She watched his strong, capable hands as they shaved thin curls of wood from the block, slowly revealing the shape of a bird hidden within. He was a creator, a builder. Barlow was a parasite, a taker. The contrast was stark. She didn't tell him what had happened. She didn't need to. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, a quiet understanding seemed to pass between them. He knew she had faced something ugly, and his silent companionship was his response. Later that evening, as Alara was preparing Faye's meager meal, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Silas. In his hands, he held a burlap sack. He held it out to her. Inside was cornmeal, a slab of salt pork, and a small tin of coffee. She stared at him, bewildered. "How?" He just shook his head slightly. "Barlow's debt is paid," he said. His voice was flat, without emotion, but his eyes were hard as flint. She understood then. He had gone to the store. He hadn't used violence. That wasn't his way. But she could imagine his presence in that store. His cold, steady silence, his unblinking gaze. He would have unnerved Barlow more than any threat. He had stood up for her. He had protected her honor when she hadn't even known how to ask. He had paid a debt she didn't know she had, freeing her from a web she hadn't realized was closing around her. "I can't pay you back," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "No need," he said. He turned and walked away into the deepening twilight, leaving her on the doorstep with the provisions, a guardian who asked for nothing in return. The food from Silas lasted them another week, a precious buffer against the encroaching starvation. But as the sack of cornmeal grew lighter, a different kind of fear began to gnaw at Alara. Faye's physical health was slowly, painstakingly improving. The rattle in her chest had lessened, and she was able to take a few steps around the cabin, her small hand clutching Alara's for support. But her spirit seemed to have been scoured away by the fever and the dust. She was quiet, withdrawn, her large eyes holding a haunted, distant look. She rarely smiled. The world, it seemed, had leached the joy right out of her. One evening, the fever returned. It came on suddenly, a wildfire that raced through Faye's frail body. Her skin was scorching to the touch, her breathing grew ragged again, and she began to murmur deliriously, her small hands picking at the quilt. Panic, cold and familiar, seized Alara. She did everything she could think of, bathing Faye's forehead with cool water, forcing sips of liquid between her cracked lips. But the fever only climbed. The town doctor was useless, and she had no money for his empty advice anyway. She felt the last of her hard-won hope beginning to crumble. She was losing her. After all the fighting, all the small victories, the dust was going to win after all. In the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when the only sound was the wind and Faye's tortured breathing, Alara made a decision. She wrapped her sister in the thickest blanket, lifted her into her arms. Faye felt impossibly light, like a bundle of dry sticks, and stepped out into the night. There was only one person she could turn to. The walk to Silas's cabin was a nightmare. The moon was hidden behind a thick veil of haze, and the land was treacherous in the dark. Alara stumbled over rocks and through patches of loose, soft dust that tried to pull her down. Faye was a dead weight in her arms, her head lolling against Alara's shoulder, her breath hot against her neck. By the time Alara saw the faint, golden glow of a lantern in Silas's window, she was on the verge of collapse, her arms screaming in protest, her lungs heaving. She didn't knock. She staggered to the door and pushed it open, half falling into the room. Silas was sitting at his small table, cleaning a rifle part by lamplight. He looked up, his face a mask of shock as he saw her, disheveled and desperate, with the sick child in her arms. He was on his feet in an instant. He didn't ask questions. He took Faye from her arms with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior and carried her to his own narrow bed in the corner of the room. He laid her down carefully, his large, calloused hand resting for a moment on her feverish forehead. "Get water," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Alara, spurred to action, rushed to his water bucket and brought him a dipper. He took a clean cloth from a chest and began to bathe Faye's face and wrists, his movements swift and sure. He seemed to know exactly what to do. While he tended to Faye, he gave Alara a series of quiet instructions. "There's a small tin box on the shelf. Bring it, and stoke the fire. We need more hot water." Alara moved as if in a trance, his calm authority a lifeline in her sea of panic. She found the tin box. Inside were dried herbs and what looked like a gnarled pale root. He took the root, and with his knife, he began to shave thin slivers of it into a mug. "My mother's remedy," he said, not looking at her, "for lung fever." She was half Osage, knew the old ways. He poured boiling water over the shavings, and a pungent, earthy smell filled the small cabin. He let it steep, the steam rising in the lantern light. The cabin was a starkly masculine space, but it was clean and orderly. Tools hung neatly on the walls, a few worn books were stacked on a shelf, and the floor was swept clean. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate, pared-down life. When the tea was ready, he cooled it slightly, then gently lifted Faye's head. "Help me," he said. Alara held her sister while Silas carefully spooned the bitter-smelling liquid into her mouth, a few drops at a time. Faye coughed and sputtered, but he was patient, persistent, making sure she swallowed some of the medicine. They worked together through the rest of the night, a silent, efficient team. He bathed her to keep the fever down. She held her and whispered soothing words, stories their mother used to tell them. They were a strange tableau in the flickering light. The big, silent man and the desperate girl, fighting for the life of a child in a small cabin at the edge of a dying world. As dawn approached, painting the dusty sky in shades of lilac and rose, the crisis seemed to pass. Faye's breathing eased, the frantic flush receded from her cheeks, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. The fever had broken. Exhaustion hit Alara like a physical blow. She sank onto a stool near the fire, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Silas watched her for a moment, then poured a mug of the herbal tea for her. "Drink," he said. "It will help." She took the mug, her hands shaking so badly that the liquid sloshed over the rim. The tea was bitter but warm. It spread through her, a calming heat. She looked at Silas, who was now sitting across from her, his face etched with fatigue in the morning light. The barrier of his silence had been broken by the night's shared crisis. "You saved her," Alara whispered, the words choked with unshed tears. I thought I was losing her." Silas looked over at the sleeping child, a flicker of an unreadable emotion in his dark eyes. He simply nodded, accepting her words as a statement of fact, not a cause for praise. "She's strong," he said. Like her sister, the compliment, so unexpected and so simply delivered, struck Alara with the force of a physical touch. He saw her. He didn't just see her desperation or her need. He saw her strength. In that moment, sitting in the quiet warmth of his cabin, sharing a mug of bitter tea while her sister slept peacefully, Alara felt the last of her defenses against him crumble. He was not just a protector or a provider. He was a partner. He had shared her burden, her fear, her vigil. He had met her at her most vulnerable, and had not turned away. He had stood with her in the dark and helped her fight for the dawn. The days that followed Faye's recovery were quiet and restorative. Silas insisted they stay with him, arguing that the shack was too drafty, the water from their well still too suspect. Alara, too weary to protest and secretly relieved, agreed. She and Faye took his narrow bed, while he made a bedroll for himself on the floor by the hearth. It was a strange, temporary domesticity. Alara took over the cooking, making nourishing broths and cornmeal mush with the supplies he provided. She mended his clothes, stitched a patch onto his blanket, and kept the small cabin tidy. It was her way of repaying him, of contributing to their shared survival. In return, he taught her things. He showed her how to set a snare for rabbits, how to identify the few edible plants that still grew in the dry creek bed, how to read the sky for the slightest change in weather. He spoke more now, not in long conversations, but in short, practical sentences. He explained the workings of a trap, the name of a bird, the reason the wind shifted. His words were like his actions, efficient, purposeful, and devoid of artifice. Faye, under their combined care, began to flourish. The warmth of the cabin, the steady supply of food, and Silas's quiet, reassuring presence seemed to heal her spirit as well as her body. She began to speak again, her small voice at first a hesitant whisper, then growing stronger. She would watch Silas for hours as he worked, her eyes wide with a child's curiosity. One afternoon, he sat down with her and, using his whittling knife, carved a small, smooth stone into the shape of a turtle. He gave it to her, and she clutched it in her hand as if it were the most precious jewel, a small smile finally returning to her lips. Alara watched them, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She was witnessing a kind of magic, the slow, patient rebuilding of a life. But their small sanctuary was an island in a sea of resentment. The town of Redemption had not forgotten them. Jed Barlow, his pride wounded by Silas's quiet intervention, had not been idle. He began to spread poison. He whispered in the general store, in the street, over the Cracker Barrel. He painted Silas as a dark, dangerous figure, a squatter with unknown intentions. He hinted that Silas had some kind of unnatural hold over Alara, that no decent woman would live with a strange man outside the bond of matrimony. The whispers found fertile ground in the town's fear and suspicion. The people of Redemption needed someone to blame for their misfortune, for the failed crops, the dust, the departed relatives. The silent outsider who kept to himself was an easy target. Alara felt the change when she next went to town for supplies. The stares were no longer just curious. They were hostile. Women who had once given her a curt nod now turned their backs. Men muttered as she passed. The air was thick with a judgment that was colder than any wind. She returned to the cabin, her small bag of flour feeling heavy with the weight of their scorn. Silas was outside, splitting firewood. He looked up as she approached and seemed to read the story on her face. "Barlow," he said. It was a statement, not a question. Alara nodded, her throat tight. "They hate us," she whispered. They think things." He stopped his work, leaning the axe against the chopping block. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his gaze distant, fixed on the hazy outline of the town. "People fear what they don't understand," he said, his voice flat. "And they hate what they fear. What will we do?" she asked, the old panic beginning to stir within her. He looked at her then, his dark eyes meeting hers. "We do nothing," he said. "We live." That's all. His calm was a rebuke to her fear. He would not be moved by the petty cruelties of others. He had built his life on a foundation of self-reliance, and he would not let their ignorance shake it. But Barlow was not content with whispers. He saw Silas's quiet defiance as a challenge. He began to escalate his campaign. One morning, Silas found the wire of one of his snares cut. A few days later, the small pile of lumber he'd been saving was gone. They were small provocations, designed to unnerve, to provoke a reaction. Silas absorbed them with his usual stoicism, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. The breaking point came on a moonless night. Alara was jolted from sleep by the sound of shouting, the guttural roar of drunken male voices. She sat up, her heart hammering. A bright, flickering light danced outside the cabin's single window. Fire! Silas was already on his feet, pulling on his boots. He moved to the door and peered through a crack. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Keep Faye away from the window." He grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth and slipped out the door, closing it softly behind him. Alara's hands were shaking. She gathered a terrified Faye into her arms, pulling the blanket around them both, and huddled in the far corner of the room, her back pressed against the solid log wall. She could hear them now, a group of men, their voices slurred with cheap whiskey and malice. "Come on out, Drifter," one of them yelled. It was Barlow's voice, high and thin with false bravado. "We don't want your kind here. Get out of Redemption." There was a crash of breaking glass as a rock shattered their window. Faye screamed, burying her face in Alara's shoulder. Outside, a torch had been thrown near the woodpile, the dry timber catching with a hungry whoosh. The mob was not just trying to scare them. They were trying to burn them out. Alara could hear Silas's voice, low and steady, cutting through the drunken shouts, but she couldn't make out the words. The men only grew louder, their courage fueled by alcohol and mob mentality. They were close to the door now, their shadows leaping and dancing in the firelight. The door rattled as someone kicked it. "Get out here and face us like a man," another voice bellowed. The flimsy wooden bar that secured the door splintered. The wood groaned. It wouldn't hold for long. A primal fear, cold and absolute, washed over Alara. They were trapped. They were going to be burned alive or dragged out, and she couldn't bear to think what. But then something shifted inside her. It was the image of Faye trembling in her arms. It was the memory of Silas on the roof in the storm, of his patient hands carving a stone turtle, of his quiet declaration. "We live." The fear was still there, but it was joined by a white-hot rage. They would not take this from her. They would not destroy this small pocket of safety she had found. She was no longer the girl who knelt in the dust. She was no longer a victim. She gently pushed Faye behind her. Her eyes scanned the small cabin, landing on the heavy wood axe Silas had left by the door. Her hands closed around its smooth, worn handle. It was heavy, solid, a tool for building, for surviving, but could also be a weapon. She took a deep breath, the smoke from the fire stinging her lungs. She stood up, planted her feet, and raised the axe, its polished head gleaming in the flickering firelight. She was no longer hiding in the corner. She was standing ready. If they broke down that door, they would not find a terrified girl. They would find a woman ready to fight for her home. The door shuddered again under a heavy blow, the wood groaning in protest. Splinters flew inward. Alara tightened her grip on the axe handle, her knuckles white. The drunken shouts outside grew more frenzied, a chaotic symphony of hatred. She could hear Barlow's voice, shrill and insistent, inciting the others. "He's got that girl in there. The witch. They're a blight on this town." Through the haze of her own fear, Alara registered that they were not just after Silas. They were after her, too. Her existence with him, outside their narrow, judgmental rules, was an affront they could not tolerate. The flimsy door was all that stood between her and their blind rage. But outside, Silas was not idle. He hadn't charged into the mob. He hadn't shouted back. He had simply moved, a dark, silent shape, to stand between the men and the cabin door. The iron poker in his hand was not a weapon he brandished, but a simple, heavy line drawn in the dirt. He was a wall of pure, unyielding presence. "Go home, Barlow," Silas said, his voice carrying with an unnerving calm over the crackle of the burning woodpile. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Barlow, emboldened by his followers, a handful of desperate, resentful men named Cletus and Roy and a few others whose faces were lost to the shadows, scoffed. "This is our town, Drifter. We're taking it back. Starting with you." He held his torch higher, its light glinting off the sweat on his face and the wildness in his eyes. Cletus, a big, lumbering man, took a step forward, brandishing a broken fence post. "We're going to run you out on a rail." Silas didn't move. He simply watched them, his dark eyes seeming to absorb the firelight, giving nothing back. He was assessing them, not as a group but as individuals. He saw the fear behind their bravado, the desperation that Barlow had twisted into hate. "You think this is about me?" Silas's voice was low, but it cut through the noise. "This isn't about me. This is about you. You've lost your farms to the dust, your families to the road. You have nothing left, so you look for someone to blame." He took a step toward them, and the mob instinctively shuffled back. "You blame me because I'm still standing, because I don't whine or cry or look for a handout. I work. I survive. And you can't stand it because it reminds you of what you've become." His words were like stones, striking hard and true. He wasn't just facing them down. He was dissecting them, laying their pathetic motives bare. A flicker of doubt crossed Cletus's face. Roy shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the ground. "He's filling your heads with poison," Silas continued, his gaze locking onto Barlow. "This man, who buys your land for pennies on the dollar and holds your debts over your heads. He tells you I'm the problem? He profits from your misery, and you let him lead you by the nose to my door with torches." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. It wasn't kicked in. It was open from the inside. Alara stood there, framed in the doorway, the firelight catching the sharp, silver edge of the axe she held at her side. Her hair was wild, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes burned with a cold, clear fire. She was not cowering. She was not screaming. She was a figure of defiance. The sight of her, armed and resolute, stunned the mob into silence. This was not the timid, starving girl they remembered. This was someone else entirely. She stepped out of the cabin to stand beside Silas. She didn't look at him, but she could feel the solid strength of his presence next to her. They stood together, a united front. Two solitary figures against the mob. "Get off this land," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. "This is our home." The word "our" hung in the air, a declaration of allegiance that was more powerful than any weapon. It redefined everything. They were not a man and a cowering victim. They were a partnership, a family. The men looked from Silas's unyielding stillness to Alara's fierce resolve. They saw the poker in his hand and the axe in hers. But more than that, they saw a kind of strength they couldn't understand and didn't possess. Their drunken courage, already frayed by Silas's words, began to evaporate completely. It was one thing to menace a lone man, another to face down a woman with nothing left to lose, defending her home. Roy dropped his club. Cletus took a stumbling step backward. Their anger, which had seemed so righteous moments before, now felt hollow and shameful. Barlow saw his power over them dissolving. "Don't listen to them," he shrieked, his voice cracking. They're unnatural." But no one was listening to him anymore. They were looking at Silas and Alara, and then at their own hands, empty or holding crude weapons, and they felt the deep, sour shame of their actions. One by one, they began to back away, melting into the darkness from which they had come. They left their torches burning on the ground like discarded sins. Soon, only Barlow was left, standing alone in the circle of firelight, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He looked at Silas, then at Alara, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Silas took a single, deliberate step toward him. He didn't raise the poker. He didn't say a word. He just looked at him. And in that look, Barlow saw the totality of his defeat. He saw a man he could not break, a woman he could not intimidate, and the utter failure of his own spiteful heart. With a small, choked cry, Barlow turned and fled, stumbling into the night like the coward he was. The fire in the woodpile began to die down. The sudden silence was vast, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the chirping of crickets, who had resumed their song as if nothing had happened. Alara's arms ached. She lowered the heavy axe, its weight a sudden, crushing burden. Her legs felt weak. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Silas turned to her. In the dying light of the fire, his face was all shadows and angles. His eyes found hers, and they held a new light, a mixture of pride, relief, and a deep, unspoken admiration. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the axe from her trembling hands. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, warm contact that sent a jolt through her. They had faced a fire, and they had one. Together. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of quiet action. The fire in the woodpile had mostly consumed itself, leaving a bed of glowing, orange embers that pulsed like a dying heart in the darkness. Silas took a bucket of water and doused the remaining flames, sending a plume of hissing steam and smoke into the night air. The acrid smell clung to everything. Inside, the cabin was a small pocket of chaos. The window was shattered, and a scattering of glass and the heavy rock that had broken it lay on the floor. Alara swept up the pieces carefully, her hands still trembling slightly. Faye, who had been hiding behind the bed, crept out, her eyes wide and frightened. Alara gathered her into a hug, murmuring soft reassurances, her own fear transmuting into a fierce, protective tenderness. Silas took a piece of canvas from his shed and tacked it securely over the broken window, sealing them back inside their sanctuary. He worked with the same methodical calm he brought to every task, as if repairing a window broken by a hateful mob was no different from mending a fence. When the immediate damage was dealt with, a profound silence settled in the small room. The three of them were suspended in the quiet space after a great violence, the air still vibrating with what had happened. Alara made a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual of comfort. She handed a steaming mug to Silas. He took it, his gaze lingering on her face. There were no words for what had passed between them. No way to articulate the terror, the rage, the strange, fierce triumph. They had stood together. That was all that mattered. They sat at the small table, Faye asleep now in the bed, clutching her stone turtle. The lantern cast a warm, intimate glow, pushing the vast, hostile darkness back outside the cabin walls. For the first time, Alara felt that this was not just his cabin where she was a guest. It was her home, a home she had defended. "They won't be back," Silas said, his voice quiet but certain. He had broken Barlow's hold. The shame of that night would keep the others away. Alara nodded. She believed him. The threat from the town had been faced and vanquished. But the larger threats, the dust, the drought, the unending hardship, remained. Yet, somehow, they seemed less daunting now. She was no longer facing them alone. The next morning, the sky was different. The perpetual hazy gray had been replaced by a low, thick blanket of bruised purple clouds. The air was heavy, still, and smelled of ozone and damp earth. The rain Silas had predicted was finally coming. It started as a few hesitant drops, spotting the thick dust on the ground, each one a tiny, dark blossom. Then it came in earnest, a steady, soaking rain that drummed on the roof, dripped from the eaves, and turned the world outside into a wash of gray. It was not a violent, storming rain, but a gentle, life-giving one. Alara and Silas stood in the open doorway, side by side, watching it fall. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. It washed the dust from the air, plastering the fine silt to the ground. It darkened the wood of the cabin, ran in small rivulets down the path. It was a baptism for the land and for them. It felt like a promise, a sign that their stand had been acknowledged by the world itself. A new chapter was beginning. In the days that followed, the land began to change. The rain had been enough to settle the dust and soak into the parched earth. And in the small garden patch they had planted, a miracle occurred. Tiny green shoots, impossibly vibrant, pushed their way up through the dark, damp soil. The beans. Their act of faith had been rewarded. Alara would kneel by the patch every morning, marveling at the stubborn, tenacious life emerging from the ground. Each new leaf felt like a personal victory. The dynamic between her and Silas had shifted as well. The silence between them was no longer one of necessity or caution. It was one of deep, abiding comfort. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their lives intertwined in a rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the damp clouds in fiery colors, Silas held out his hand. In his palm was the piece of wood he was always whittling. It was finished. It was a small, exquisitely carved bird, its wings half spread as if caught in the moment just before taking flight. The detail was incredible, each feather etched with care. He placed it in her hand. The wood was smooth and warm. It was not just a carving, it was a symbol, a promise of hope, of rising above the dust. "For you," he said. She looked from the bird to his face. His dark eyes were soft, his usual stoic mask gone, replaced by an open, vulnerable tenderness. In that moment, she saw the entirety of the man, his strength, his kindness, his solitude, his quiet, profound heart. Her own heart felt full to bursting. She had come to him with nothing, a beggar offering to polish his boots for a scrap of food. She had been hollowed out by grief and fear, a ghost in her own life. Now she was whole. She was strong. She had found not just a protector, but a partner. She had found a home not in a place, but in a person. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place. The rains might not last. The dust would surely return. But Alara was no longer afraid. She looked out at the vast, empty landscape, which no longer seemed desolate, but full of a stark, quiet beauty. Resilience, she realized, was not about the absence of hardship. It was about facing it. It was about planting a seed in barren ground. It was about standing in the dark, side by side, and refusing to be extinguished. She closed her hand around the small wooden bird, its delicate form a solid, reassuring weight in her palm. She looked at Silas, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He returned it with a slight, almost imperceptible smile of his own. It was enough. It was everything. The sun dipped below the horizon, but they did not go inside. They sat together in the gathering dusk, two survivors, ready to face whatever the next dawn would bring.